Hello everybody, welcome back to Comedian MTG. So this video is long overdue. We are breaking down my favorite cEDH deck of all time, no questions. It is the deck I've played the most, it is the deck that I have evolved the most, that's gone through so many changes. It is my favorite cEDH deck of all time. Welcome to the deck tech for Dawnwaker Thrasios. So this deck evolved out of the old evolution style decks. So basically what Alton 7 had been doing way back, when Underworld Breach first got printed, there was basically, I saw Zirda the Dawnwaker get printed and saw that it was a really easy infinite combo because the way that Zirda works, it makes both Basalt and Grim Monolith go infinite because they'll be able to tap for more mana than it costs to untap them. Now, what's crazy is, for the first time ever in this deck, Grim Monolith is actually not in the deck, but we can go into that in more detail in a little bit. But I figured this was the perfect time to do this deck tech because of the fact that the deck just went through a major change. With the printing of Swift Reconfiguration, we now have a new way to not only have a very clean 3-mana infinite mana combo, we also have a way to do it with a hasty mana dork, and we have a different completely all creature combo that does not use artifacts. So Swift Reconfigurations printing really added a lot to this deck, and let's talk about this deck in more detail, and then we'll come back to the Swift combo. So the point of this deck is to have Thrasios and Bruce Tarl in the command zone. Now, the reason for this specific color combination is the fact that this is the only Thrasios combo that allows you to have Zirda in the 99 of your deck, because you need the red-white and you need to have Thrasios' colors, which is green-blue. So that's kind of where the inception of this specific archetype came from. The point is that it is basically a blacklist turbo infinite mana deck. So you're really utilizing Thrasios and the ability to activate Thrasios in any number of times as much as possible. So it's a pretty interesting list. Thrasios is a huge part of the deck. It is like in my opinion, it is like the Thrasios deck and the Seedborn deck. Specifically, because Bruce Tarl has 4 converted mana cost, cards like Neoform and Eldritch Evolution allow you to turn your commander into a Seedborn Muse. So I have often described this deck as a turbo Seedborn Muse deck. That is one of the easiest ways to win with the deck, is to have your Thrasios out, eventually play your Bruce Tarl just for value, get some mana off your other things, and then Neoform or Eldritch Evolution into your Seedborn Muse. And if you get at least 1 or 2 rotations of the table with the Seedborn Muse out, you usually win, depending on what your opponents are doing. Sometimes you need to play Table Police for a little bit, but that's kind of the general idea. So back to the infinite mana combos. What are the infinite mana combos in this deck, and how do they win the game? Let's start with how to assemble infinite mana. So the first thing we mentioned before was Zirda the Dawnwaker. Now, as I mentioned, Grim Monolith is no longer in the deck, and the reason for that is the deck's actually very color mana intensive, meaning that generating a large amount of colorless mana really only worked for a handful of cards as a benefit. And apart from that, it was much more of a premium to have colored mana rocks, and me tapping out for a Grim Monolith was a play pattern that often just had a dead card on the battlefield in the majority of games. Now, you'll be able to look at this deck and come up with examples of times in which Grim Monolith can definitely be helpful, but I found over hundreds and hundreds of games that Grim Monolith just became less and less powerful. In addition, we used to be on Power Artifact, which was another reason to play Grim Monolith too, and unfortunately that card just kind of rotated out over time because it was one of the worst and also hardest to tutor for win cons. So in a combination of all of those things, Grim Monolith is no longer in the deck. So we have Zirda the Dawnwaker, and it is able to go infinite with Basalt Monolith. Because of the way Zirda is worded, it makes the untap ability on Basalt Monolith only cost 1 mana. So therefore, with Basalt on the battlefield, you can tap for 3 mana, untap it for 1, tap it for 3 mana, untap it for 1. Therefore, you're netting 2 mana every time you engage in that loop. The second infinite combo comes with Dockside Extortionist. So you have Dockside on the battlefield, and if you can make at least 4 treasures, what you'll be able to do is have Emil on the battlefield and pay 3 mana to use Emil's first ability, which is to exile another creature you control and return it to the battlefield. So if you're making 4 mana, what will happen is you'll pay 3, have Dockside come back in, and it'll make 4 treasures. You use 3 of those to do that again, and you'll make infinite treasures if you have 4 mana in Dockside. Speaking of Basalt Monolith, like we mentioned earlier, Kinnan does something very similar. So instead of making the untap cost less, what Kinnan says is that an artifact can tap for more. So Basalt Monolith actually taps for 4 with Kinnan on the battlefield. So you're able to tap it for 4 and then untap it for 3 colorless mana. Therefore, you're netting a colorless mana every single time. That's how you go infinite with Kinnan and Basalt Monolith. And the final infinite mana pair is involving Devoted Druid. Now, there are 2 separate ways in this deck to go infinite with Devoted Druid. The first of these is with modern combo Vizier of Remedies. And what it says is if 1 or more -1 counters will be put on a creature, it gets that many -1 instead. And you can give a -1 to Devoted Druid to make it untap. So you can tap Devoted for 1 green mana, and then you can go to untap it. Now, normally you would put a -1/-1 counter on that, but with Vizier on the battlefield, what it says is you're going to take 1 less of those, and that would bring it to 0, because it does not limit the fact that you can go to 0. So basically, you can tap for green, untap it with no downside, and continue tapping and untapping it, and create infinite green mana. There's also another way to go infinite with Devoted Druid. If you have Devoted Druid on the battlefield, and this one is very important because this one actually ignores Summoning Sickness. With the Vizier combo, Devoted Druid needs to not have Summoning Sickness. But with this next combo, with brand new Kamigawa Commander card Swift Reconfiguration turns Devoted Druid into a vehicle. It's important also that this card has Flash, so you can have your Devoted Druid on the battlefield, and then in response to someone going for a win, you can pay 1 white mana and have your Devoted Druid be able to go infinite. Because what'll happen is it will still have all the abilities of Devoted Druid, so it will become a vehicle. It makes it a vehicle with crew 5 and loses all their card types. So what happens there is it sees that it's a vehicle, it can still put the -1/-1 counters on it, but because it's not a creature and because it's an artifact at that time, it will actually just continue to accrue -1/-1 counters, and you can continue tapping it for green. Also, because it's now an artifact and not a creature until it's crewed, it does not have Summoning Sickness. So for 3 mana, you can play Devoted Druid Swift Reconfiguration and just make infinite green mana. And you can still, once again, do that at instant speed. So say you have your Thrasios and Devoted Druid on the battlefield, and your opponent, say, goes for an ad nauseum. In response, you can pay 1 white mana, Swift Reconfiguration your Devoted Druid, make infinite green, draw your whole deck all in response to what your opponents are doing. So it's a super strong option here. Back to Vizier Devoted Druid, it's also very important to note that this combo is a 2-creature combo. The rest of the combos in the deck have some sort of other restriction. For example, Dockside and Emil is a 2-creature combo, but it also requires your opponents have 4 treasures. If you look at the Zerda or the Kinnan combos, those require the use of an artifact. With Vizier and Devoted Druid, they do require not to have Summoning Sickness, but it is a 2-creature combo, and it doesn't use artifacts in any way, meaning you can go off through a Collector Roof. Okay, so now you have infinite mana. What do you do with the infinite mana when you have it? So the whole point is to get Thrasios on the battlefield. With Thrasios, you'll be able to basically pick up your entire library, putting all your tapped lands onto the battlefield. The quickest way to actually just end the game is to cast a Finale of Devastation. Now, the Finale of Devastation will pull out a creature out of your deck, but if you cast it for 10 or more, you cast it for, say, 1,000,000. Your creatures get haste, and they get +1,000,000, +1,000,000. So all your creatures in the battlefield become instant lethal attackers, and you can attack your opponents. When you're doing that, obviously it helps to play all the creatures out of your deck first, because once again, you have your deck in your hand at this point. So you play all the creatures in your deck, and then you go for the big finale. That is the cleanest way to win the game. However, what happens if you don't have your finale? Then you have to be a little bit more creative. So the list is playing Eternal Witness. And as we mentioned earlier with the combo, it's playing Emiel. So the way this works is if you have Emiel and Eternal Witness onto the battlefield and infinite mana, you can keep infinitely flickering your Eternal Witness, meaning you can cast a spell and infinitely buy it back from your graveyard. So cards, for example, the easiest way to explain this is with Lightning Bolt. So you can Lightning Bolt your opponent with your infinite mana. You then go, okay, I'm going to play Eternal Witness, get back my Lightning Bolt. I'm going to Lightning Bolt you again. I'm going to use Emil, flicker Eternal Witness, and grab my Lightning Bolt back. I'm going to Lightning Bolt you again, and I can keep doing this infinitely. There are other options too, so say you don't have your Lightning Bolt, you can actually silence your opponents out of their turns infinitely with the Eternal Witness loop. There's also being able to cast a spell and then being able to swan song your own spell to make infinite swans. So there's definitely a couple different ways to be able to create something like infinite creatures when you have your whole deck in your hand. But the easiest way is to go for Finale, and then the Eternal Witness loops are the second easiest way. And the reason that there's not something just like a Thassa's Oracle in this deck is because you don't actually need it. You don't need to be playing a dead card like Thassa's Oracle, because Thassa's Oracle does nothing outside of that I win the game button. So your card quality gets to be a lot higher. So you have Emil, which is not only a thing that can, win the game when you have infinite mana, but it's also a combo piece on top of that. You have Eternal Witness, which is a huge value creature on top of the fact that it ends up at winning you the game at the end. Lightning Bolt, it's a great removal piece that also happens to double as a win con. So something to think about when you're looking at this list is that a lot of the cards are included because they have a lot higher card quality. So I think the best use of the time right now would be to go through each section and talk about specific pieces that might be a little confusing or that might just want to be drawn to extra attention for. So we have our slew of mana dorks here, which is obviously you're playing these colors, you want to include as many as you can. Obviously with Thrasios in the command zone, being able to generate consistent mana is really important. So as opposed to like a turbo deck where you want something like a Grim Monolith or a Mana Vault or rituals like Simian Spirit Guide, Elvish Spirit Guide, in this deck you want consistent mana so that you can keep tapping out for your Thrasios every turn, under your Seedborn Muse, etc., etc. You want to be able to activate Thrasios as much as possible. Esper Sentinel was a great pickup for this deck. I have been asked before why I'm not on Ragavan in this list. This list is like a definitive mid-range list. You really want to be able to have consistent mana. You want to be able to have mana that is always kind of getting you value. And Ragavan, I found that in the games that went longer, which is kind of this deck's bread and butter, you want the games that go longer. I found that in those games, Ragavan was not really able to connect with opponents because they started playing their own creatures. Even, turbo decks after a while, they're playing their Tymnas, they're playing their Kroms, things like that. That and a regular mana dork is much better with Seedborn Muse because it will be able to untap on everybody's turn, whereas Ragavan can only get in combat damage once per table rotation. Something to think about. Now, is there a world in which you can cut a spell for Ragavan at some point and include it on top of these things? Yes, but as I mentioned, it kind of doesn't synergize with what we're trying to do as an overall game plan, and that's really important to the deck. Kinnan in this deck is just so powerful. It's like one of the secondary commanders of this deck. This deck is actually really funny because there's a lot of like important legendary creatures that act as like a second commander when you get them out, and Kinnan's one of them. The fact that it makes all your mana dorks tap for a bunch, you have a bunch of mana rocks that also then start tapping for a bunch, that all contributes to your Thrasios activations. Kinnan's really, really strong, and you're not grabbing like a Seedborn Muse with your Green Sun Zenith. Kinnan is almost always my second option, apart from Devoted Druid if I have a combo ready to go. Speaking of which, Green Sun Zenith already had a ton of value in this deck because, as I mentioned, this deck can kind of feel like a turbo Seedborn Muse deck. Being able to grab Devoted Druid now, that's a combo piece with Green Sun Zenith, has been a huge upgrade for this deck. So the Devoted Druid combos took a little bit to get into this deck, but now that they're here, they have been a really, really awesome benefit for this list. Dockside, obviously super strong in this deck. The fact that you can have an infinite mana outlet in the command zone for your Dockside on top of everything is really, really strong. Many of the iterations that have existed before of this deck have been more or less focused on Dockside. I definitely had a version way back when people were going super, super greedy in the turbo meta, where this deck was literally like turbo Dockside, punish those decks, which was awesome, but it's not gonna help you if you're not playing in like a very specific meta. So there's definitely ways to build this deck that are much harder leaning into Dockside. I found that this version is much better in a general meta. Vizier is a combo piece. It's pretty dead, but so are a lot of the 2-card combo pieces in the colors for this format. And I found that Vizier as an inclusion, opening up a 2-card creature combo and opening up the possibility for a combo that does not get affected by Collector Oof, I found the upside of having it in the deck is way more important than the potential downside for it. Ranger Captain is just a strong card. I just feel like mentioning it because I think if you're playing a white deck, you should be playing Ranger Captain of Eos. It's one of the best cards in the format right now. It changes the way play patterns work. It can go from being this like don't you combo off button to I'm gonna have a protected win button with almost no effort or input. Spellseeker is actually really big for this deck because the fact that it can turn your 2-drops, it can turn your Thrasios when you Neoform or Eldritch Evolution things into it. It can turn creature tutors into spell tutors, which we're not playing black, so the ability to convert your tutors like that actually ends up coming up pretty often, especially in the long game. So it's worth noting that Spellseeker is that option where, like, say you need a Cyclonic Rift really badly and all you have is a Neoform in hand, you can Neoform your Thrasios into a Spellseeker, get that Cyclonic Rift, be ready to go. So the whole point of this deck was built around Zirda, and the fact that Zirda is training grounds on a stick, right? It makes Thrasios' ability cost 2 less. So Zirda just happens to be a combo piece that also has a lot of synergy with our commander. So Zirda's super cool card. It's a really unique combo piece for the deck. It helps the grind engine of the deck a lot, and it just really having this combo piece that's also this value engine is so good in the command zone. So Phyrexian Metamorph is a new inclusion in the deck that has been in the deck beforehand. And the reason it actually replaced Phantasmal Image recently was because although it cost up to 1/2 more than Phantasmal Image, the benefits of it in this list specifically are actually gigantic. The ability to copy artifacts has actually come in really, really clutch at time because of the fact that, say you have a Zirda or a Kinnan on the battlefield and your opponent has a Grim Monolith or a Basalt Monolith, you can actually use your Phyrexian Metamorph to copy their Basalt Monolith. Phantasmal Image also, with Emil, isn't able to copy a Dockside and go infinite, whereas Phyrexian Metamorph is, because Phantasmal Image would end up sacrificing itself to being targeted by Emil's ability. But if your opponents have a Dockside on the battlefield, you have a Phyrexian Metamorph, make a Dockside, it makes more than 4 treasures, or 4 treasures or more, you're going off with Emil, and you can actually win without a real Dockside on your side of the field. So Phyrexian Metamorph has a lot of benefits in this deck, and it's in this specific variant of these colors, I think it's much better than Phantasmal Image. Now, once again, that's just for this deck specifically because this deck has very specific needs that it fills a lot better, not in the overall meta. And then last but not least, Seedborn Muse. As I mentioned, this is like the Seedborn Muse deck. It's super strong in this list. Be prepared, and this is something that you learn over a really long time that I learn a lot. People sometimes treat Seedborn Muse like an ad nause, and Seedborn Muse is a win condition, right? It will start generating you value and get you to your win. But if you are untapping and then using your Thrasios activations to counter someone's win turn after turn, you really need to be open with the table about the fact that Seedborn Muse sometimes just stems the bleeding and doesn't actually win you the game. Sometimes Seedborn Muse resolves and wins, like almost immediately. But there's also play patterns in which it exists on the battlefield and it is just stopping you from dying over and over again. And sometimes your opponents will go to remove it and you actually have to politic situations where you need to express to them. And it genuinely has come up many times, and it's not like a trick thing. But Seedborn Muse being on the battlefield so you can play Table Police is actually better than Seedborn Muse not existing and you drawing a few cards, right? So it's a very tough card to play correctly. It's tough in situations where you have to like bring your opponents with you to your way of thinking. But when it gets on the battlefield, it's an insanely powerful card. There's a bunch of different ways to tutor it in this list, which we'll cover in a bit. And it's just such a strong card with Thrasios. It's insane. On to the sorceries. So none of these should be too surprising. Green Sun Zenith, as we mentioned, we really want to get Seedborn Muse out, but it also grabs Kinnan and Devoted Druid, which are really great targets. It grabs Ewit for recursion, and then you don't really ever want to grab a Dork with it, but I guess at desperate times, if you mulligan really low, that it's something it can do. Ponder, I don't think you should leave your house without. If you're not playing Tymna, I think you should at the very least be on Ponder when it comes to cantrips, sometimes more. This deck, because of all of the many moving pieces in it, I'm only on Ponder and Brainstorm for cantrips, but there are other lists where I'm on Ponder, Preordain, Opt, Consider, and Brainstorm, you know? So it depends on the list. Finale of Devastation is like stupid good in this deck. Just being able to Finale for 4, grab a Dockside most of the time is usually a game-winning play in a lot of pods because people love feeding Docksides. But Finale is really good, and the flexibility to be able to grab any creature and also just be a win con is gigantic. We mentioned Neoform, Eldritch Evolution, super powerful options in this deck. They're like some of the appeal of playing green and blue is just you have these cards and they're really, really strong when you play playing a bunch of mana dorks too. And the fact that your commander can Neoform or Eldritch Evolution into your Seedborn Muse is gigantic. That is, I mean, that's a huge part of the play patterns of this deck. Now, Wargate is one that I get asked about a lot, but it was kind of a discovery that I found for this list, and I don't suggest it in many decks. In fact, I don't suggest it in basically any deck but this one, with a little asterisk on that statement. But Wargate is really, really, really good in this deck. The fact that all of your combos involve permanents is huge. And once again, we are not playing black. So the fact that this gets any of the permanents we need is gigantic. It's literally a card I get so excited when I see off of Thrasios activation. Like, Wargate is legitimately one of the best cards in this deck, and it's so hard to describe because it's such a weird card. But the easiest way, I think, to sell Wargate to people is the fact that you can make X equal to 0. And if you make X equal to 0, Wargate says, pay green, white, blue, and get a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. That doesn't count as your land drop per turn. And that alone makes Wargate playable in this deck. The fact that it is just like, for 3 mana, it's not a crop rotation because it's actually better in the sense that it puts it right onto the battlefield and you don't have to sacrifice the land and doesn't count as your land per turn. So 3 mana, and especially in a Thrasios deck that uses a Seedborn Muse a ton, Gaia's Cradle makes a ton of mana in this list. So being able to pay 3 mana and then just boom, Gaia's Cradle's on the battlefield is really, really strong. It's like very, very strong for this deck. So Wargate has been a great inclusion in this list. And then other times it's, you know, say you need your Dockside, you just pay 5 mana into it, which once again, this deck makes a ton of mana because we want to activate Thrasios turn after turn. So it's not that hard to do. And then you can pay for different things. So if you want to go grab your Swift reconfiguration, which you can grab off of this card, you only have to pay 4 mana into it and then put it on your Devoted Druid. So Wargate is really, really strong. It's insanely flexible, which is kind of the appeal of it in a deck in which you don't have the black tutors. So Wargate is just an awesome include, and I would not cut this card for anything. All right, so moving on to the instance, there's not that many crazy things here. Just a lot of your classic run-of-the-mill cEDH instance. You have your tutors, your counter spells, all of that junk. The blasts, I've been a little on and off with for a while. Right now I'm on Red Blast because I think its card quality is high enough, especially if you're going against other grindy decks with things like Ristic Studies or Crom. So Red Blast is in there for now. I don't know how long it's going to stay for, but it's a good card. Because of the way Thrasios, how cheap it is, you very consistently have Deflecting Swat and Fierce Guardianship online, which is a very big part of the play patterns of this deck. The fact that both of those cards are, you know, immediately available, and it's not like a Rogrek deck where you're inclined to sacrifice your Thrasios, right? You want your Thrasios on the battlefield all the time. So the Swat and Guardianship combo with this deck is really sweet. Muddle the Mixture is a decent counterspell when you need it to be a counterspell, and then sometimes, as we mentioned, you don't have the black tutors, so being able to get any card with CMC2 is gigantic. I mean, we'll go over some of the biggest hits of the 2-drops, and this is just in what we've covered. We got Mana Drain, Eladamri's Call, Cyclonic Rift, Neoform, Finale of Devastation, Dockside, Devoted Druid, Gilded Drake, Kinnan, Vizier. Like, there's so many insane 2-drops in this deck. It just makes a ton of sense to be playing Muddle. So Muddle is very, very strong for being able to win the game. And then the rest of the forces, and then Mindbreak Trap, which if you haven't seen a deck tech on my channel yet, I'm very high on Mindbreak Trap. It is really good to have a free answer to a lot of stuff. It can also exile things in the stack, meaning things like countering an LED into a breach normally isn't a good play pattern, but being able to Mindbreak Trap and exile it is actually pretty huge. Decks with a lot of recursion, like Korvold, being able to exile their Docksides. Like, the exile part of this comes up quite a lot. I have hard cast it before because, once again, we're holding up Thrasios activation. So in a desperate situation, a 4-mana counterspell that most of the time is a free blowout is totally fine. It also can hit every copy of Flusterstorm. There's a lot of upsides to Mindbreak Trap. So it's a really powerful card, and I really encourage it in the current meta. So a bunch of mana artifacts here. Springleaf Drum I know isn't the most common, but the thing is, with the way with Thrasios curving out, a lot of the times you can on 1 play your Springleaf Drum, pass, and then when it comes back to you, you can play your Thrasios and then have a mana available, which is kind of makes it like a mana dork, and there's a lot of creatures in this deck that you won't be attacking with and you won't be blocking with, really, Thrasios being one of them. So being able to turn Thrasios into a mana dork is actually pretty nice, and it comes up quite a lot. So I've been very happy with Springleaf Drum, and it's kind of in this deck over Arcane Signet because there are almost no scenarios in which you cannot actually use the Springleaf Drum, and it costing 1 as opposed to 2 is actually pretty gigantic for tempo in this deck. And the reason we kind of have an artifact like this is for when you are drawing your deck and you have almost infinite mana. Springleaf Drum is also really good at like helping you convert some of that infinite colorless or infinite green mana into other colors. And then obviously Basalt Monolith isn't the best mana rock at all, but it combos with 2 very powerful creatures in our deck. So the fact that Zerda and Kinnan have such a high card quality, and you only really have to play 1 kind of medium bad card with them to make it work, is really cool. Also, Basalt Monolith sometimes helps you with your X spells, and it helps you if you have Seedborn Muse specifically. Basalt Monolith gets way better, so it's a pretty cool card. The enchantments have a lot of powerful cards here. Training Grounds, obviously 1 mana, making our Thrasio stuff cost less, super awesome. We have Swift Reconfiguration, which is just obviously a combo piece. I'm a fan of Never Leaving Home Without a Wild Growth. I think the card's really, really good. Deck is on Rest in Peace. So I want to bring up Rest in Peace specifically here because 1, I think it's super powerful in the current meta. But if you notice, there's a few cards I've mentioned before that do affect the graveyard. I am on Noxious Revival. I am on Eternal Witness. The idea behind that is that, yes, those cards are dead if Rest in Peace is on the battlefield, but the other times they are very impactful cards. For specifically Noxious Revival and Ewit are really good when you are trying to assemble your win from infinite mana at the end of the game, but they also just have a really high card quality, and the kind of the concept that you would always have Rest in Peace in play isn't really a good one to go by. Another thing I've talked about with people beforehand is that if you have your Rest in Peace on the battlefield and you have infinite mana, you can always just like draw your deck and then bounce your own Rest in Peace, so that you can do the loop that we talked about earlier involving Eternal Witness and Emil. So that's always an option you have when you've assembled infinite mana, is you can just remove your own Rest in Peace so that you can start comboing. Summon Library, Rhystic, Mystic, all fantastic draw engines. Smothering Tithe is actually a recent addition. So in the early versions of this deck, I was not happy with this card because when I first was playing this deck like way back in ooh man, is it 2020 now? I don't know, it's been a long time. I've been playing this deck for a really long time, but when the deck first had its first iteration, Smothering Tithe was in the deck. It was playing Wheels back then. I got rid of the Wheels almost instantly because I don't think you should ever play Wheels in a mid-range deck unless it's like an Opus Thief style deck. So then Smothering Tithe kind of left with it because it was a time in cEDH where people were really aggressively countering value engines. It's not the meta we live in right now. So Smothering Tithe has a lot more utility in this current meta than it ever had before. That, and it's basically, I was looking at other things to basically be a second Seedborn Muse, not for like when you already have a Seedborn Muse, but like if Seedborn Muse is not currently available, what's our other options? And Smothering Tithe was a really good one because you can tap out for Smothering Tithe, and with your Thrasios in the battlefield, like by the time it gets back to you, it's nowhere near the level of mana that Seedborn Muse gets you. But even if it's just draw steps per turn, that's usually, people never pay for Smothering Tithe. I don't know if it's just the games I play in, but people almost never play for Smothering Tithe. And so it's at least refunding you 3 of the 4 mana in the first rotation of the table if your opponents draw no extra cards, which isn't always the case. And also, if it is taxing your opponents, like, congratulations, you've taxed your opponents by playing this enchantment. So either way, the card is actually really good in the current meta, and then people are greedy, so they're playing decks like, just had an opponent playing Corvold into a Smothering Tithe, and anytime they were cracking a treasure or sacrificing a permanent, they were drawing cards, but I was also making mana while they were doing that. So Smothering Tithe has paid off quite well, and it's still newer to my paper version of this deck, but it really feels like it's earned its place in the current meta, at least very quickly. All right, and the lands, there's a few special ones. So if you notice, there is no Ancient Tomb in this deck, and that is in correlation with everything that we talked about beforehand, and the fact that like you want to be playing your turn 1 dorks. You want to play your turn 1 dorks into your turn 2 Thrasios. You don't have any 2 mana rocks. So Ancient Tomb actually really doesn't do a lot for this deck. So colorless lands take a lot to play, which is why the colorless land slot has actually been taken over by Emergence Zone. And Emergence Zone, especially in this deck, is freaking huge. One, you can get it off of Wargate, which is really cool to be able to have that and then just have that ready to go at any time. It doesn't have the same like potency that like being able to crop rot into an E-Zone does in certain decks, but you don't really need to force that pretty hard. Emergent Zone is really cool because there's situations where, say you have your Thrasios out, you can actually scry your Emergent Zone to the top, put it into the battlefield, and then by the time it's the next person's turn, your Emergent Zone is untapped and ready to go. E-Zone is just really, really strong in this list because of how many redundant overlapping combos we have and the amount of interaction and things that you can do at instant speed in response to somebody's win. So having E-Zone, and specifically E-Zone in a deck where you're really trying to have Seedborn Muse all the time, being able to like activate Thrasios on somebody's turn, pass, you untap with Seedborn Muse again, say they hold up a bunch of mana, you just activate Thrasios again, and then the next player tries to go for the win, suddenly the other player's tapping out to counter their stuff, and now there's this huge counter war. You can be like, okay, well, I'm just going to Emergent Zone crack and win over the top of these things. Obviously, like, it's pretty easy to read the value of Emergent Zone over the top here, but specifically in an archetype where you're really focusing on having Seedborn Muse in the battlefield, Emergent Zone is actually gigantic in this list. Very, very strong card here. This is a fantastic Gaea's Cradle deck. I don't really have much more to say apart from that. Like, the card's just really, really strong, and it's very, very strong here. And I think we're gonna jump over to the play test feature here on Moxfield to just go over, we'll probably get like 5 keepable hands just to give you a general idea of what's keepable in this deck. So already starting off really, really strong here. I see a turn 1. So we have our City of Brass here. Sorry, it's a little cut off, but that's okay. So we have a City Brass, Esper Sentinel, Rest in Peace, Jiraga Tree Speaker, Chain Vapor, Wooded Foothills, and a Taiga. With a hand like this, I'm tempted to play an Esper Sentinel turn 1 because Esper Sentinel is just kind of like a 1 mana, 1-time Mystic Remora in a lot of games. It's obviously not as strong as Mystic Remora, but also it doesn't cost as much consistently and frequently as Mystic Remora does. It's one of those things you can invest into it and then move on with your life. And then next turn being able to untap and either play like both of these dorks, being able to play Rest in Peace, it's really strong. Now I chose to play Esper Sentinel there over Jiraga Tree Speaker because if we leveled up Tree Speaker next turn, it could tap for 2 green, but if you remember at the time, we didn't have any green payoffs in hand, and I think getting an early Esper Sentinel out is much more important than kind of having to time walk yourself for 2 turns trying to invest in the Tree Speaker. So that's a really keepable first 7. We're going to move on to another one. So this hand here is Resculpt, Force of Negation, City of Brass, Mana Confluence, Eldritch Evolution, Steam Vents, and Basalt Monolith. Now, this hand is not really doing anything for us. We have a bunch of 3-drops in hand. We have no early mana dorks, which are super necessary for this deck. So we're really only keeping the fact that we have Force of Negation to be able to interact with our opponents, but we can't develop our board whatsoever. So we're definitely going to go to a second 7 here. Okay, we have Swift Reconfiguration, Mindbreak Trap, Rest in Peace, Eldritch Evolution, Soul Ring, Mana, or Mystic Remora, and Zerda. There are no lands in this hand, and therefore we're going to mulligan down to 6. Down here at 6, it's another kind of bad hand. It's pretty unfortunate. We're getting pretty unlucky with this slew of cards, but we have Spell Snare, Flooded Strand, Tundra, Wooded Foothills, Force of Negation, Swords, and Rejuvenating Springs. We're at 6. I have no problem going to 5 here. This hand is just kind of medium. It's a bunch of interaction, but you have no mana engines, you have no card advantage engine here, and you can't even activate Thrasios until the 4th turn, so I really don't want to ever keep a hand like this. So we're going to go to 5. Okay, this is a very risky hand. So we have Deflecting Spot, Fierce Guardianship, Mana Drain, Rest in Peace, Dockside, Tundra, Lotus Petal. So depending on your pod, right? So say you're going forth in a pod that's all Grixis Turbo decks, there's a world where you can keep this Dockside and have it pay off really, really hard for you. The fact that if you get another mana, you have both Deflecting Spot and Fierce Guardianship backup for your commander, because you only have to pay 2 into Thrasios. It's pretty big. I probably bottom Mana Drain and Rest in Peace here, so it's just these 5. And the hand, if you want to keep this one, is keepable on a risk, and I think it's worth it to keep it for a risky hand like this. But there's also an argument to go to 4 here. So if we went to 4 cards, what would it be? So we have an Eldritch Evolution, Force of Will, Sylvan Library, Temple Garden, Gilded Drake, Ranger Captain, and Tarnished Citadel. I think you keep your 2 lands here, probably keep Sylvan Library so that you have some sort of card advantage, way to dig yourself out of the hole that is mulliganing to 4. And then I think I would either keep Gilded Drake or Ranger Captain, depending on what pod you're in. Would depend on which of these is more valuable to you. Obviously, you can cast the Gilded Drake before you can cast the Ranger Captain, but it depends on what you draw for your turn. I really like Ranger Captain because it's just a powerful card. All right, so this is the first 7. Kind of medium. We can't really do anything on turn 1. Tarnished Citadel, Rest in Peace, Exotic Orchard, Mox Amber, Eladamri's Call, Spellseeker, and Delay. I'm not really a fan of this hand, so we're gonna mulligan it back. Okay, so this hand's really good. This is a Llanowar Elves, Delay, Arid Mesa, Volcanic Island, Esper Sentinel, Force of Negation, Green Sun Zenith. So this is a really solid hand because you can turn 1. I'm always gonna be inclined to go for the Dork turn 1 in a situation like this because of the fact that it's immediately tapping for mana and you can use that mana next turn. Then you're going to untap and have the ability to play an Esper Sentinel. We actually drew Lotus Petal there, and we can Green Suns. If we want to go grab a Kinnan, we could do that. If we want to sandbag the Green Suns, it's fine. You can also play Thrasios. So having Esper Sentinel and Thrasios on the battlefield, a bunch of mana acceleration, makes this hand super, super solid. So that's a really keepable, I believe, second 7. All right, let's look at another one here. This one's interesting. So we have Tree Speaker. And once again, so Tree Speaker is definitely like the last mana dork of the deck, where it's like keeping it is definitely a bit of an investment. This slot tends to bounce around between Arbor Elf, Avacyn's Pilgrim, and Jiraga Tree Speaker a lot because they're all kind of the worst mana dork that could be in the spot. It's tough. Situations like this make me really not want to play Tree Speaker, where it's super awkward. It's just that green mana is often more valuable than white mana. Like this deck is very heavily green-blue with like splashes of white and red. So that being said, like Tree Speaker feels like it should be playing for more or paying for more than it does in these couple hands here. But it's worth noting like how bad it's been in these mulligans, and it might be worth replacing with something that's going to at least give a little more value than it currently does, because it's been awkward in these for sure. Ironically, Arbor Elf would actually be better in this hand. So by the time this video comes out, you might have seen me switch back to Arbor Elf because of these terrible, terrible mulligans. Here we are. So in this situation, it's still a pretty good hand because you can either play Tree Speaker or Remora turn 1. Being able to level up Remora is pretty decent, or level up Tree Speaker in the next turn is pretty decent, but you can also like play Tree Speaker and instead play Rest in Peace instead of leveling it up. So there's a lot of value in this hand. It's a pretty cool hand. Definitely a solid keep. All right, this first 7, this will probably be our last keep for the mulligan section. So this first 7, you can... Okay, so the only time I ever keep this hand, we have Command Tower, Worldly Tutor, Spellseeker, Seedborn, Wooded Foothills, Eternal Witness, and Gilded Drake. The only time I ever want to keep this hand is when I'm in a pod where I know for a fact they're going to feed the ever-living crud out of my dockside. Because in that pod, this hand's insane. Because you can get out an early dockside turn 2 by Worldly Tutoring for it on turn 1, and then probably... there's some scenarios where you might even be able to jam your Seedborn Muse and your Thrasios if they really, really feed your dockside. And if not, you have a bunch of really solid mid-range creatures here that are pretty good to have out. So in this scenario, I would keep this hand. But for the sake of this video, we're going to say this isn't a hand where we're expecting a super dockside. So let's go to our second 7. So this hand's interesting. There's a bunch of early stuff we can do. So turn 1, we have the option to either Ponder or Training Grounds or hold up Lightning Bolt. So all super decent options. Not great options, but decent options. We also have Neoform here, so if we grab creatures, we can, Neoform our Dorks or Thrasios or Bruce Tarl eventually into a Seedborn Muse. And Cyclonic Rift is just solid removal. However, in the current meta, this hand usually is too slow. It does a lot of really powerful things. Ponder's a very strong card. Training Ground's a really strong card. You can go Training Grounds into Thrasios, into activation the next turn, holding up your Lightning Bolt, your Cyclonic Rift. Like, all of those things are really good. But I just think this is too slow for the current meta we live in. So I think it has to go to 6. Ooh, this one's a real stinker, I'm not gonna lie. Bolt, Neoform, 4 lands, and a Seedborn Muse. This hand's just so slow. Another super, super slow hand. So we're just going to go to 5 here. Oh, this is totally fine for a 5. Obviously, depending on what the turn order of the table is, there's a scenario where you have gemstones and a land, and then turn 1, you can play Elvish Mystic and play Training Grounds. And then if you draw a land, you can play Thrasios and hold up an activation the turn after that, depending on what you put to the bottom, what you exile with Gemstone Caverns, etc. So super solid 5. This is like kind of a dream 5. And yeah, if you ever get this hand as like a 7, super nutty hand. This is exactly what you want to see in this deck. The ability to like tutor more stuff, to have a little bit of interaction, have a mana dork, have a value engine, whether that be Remora or Rhystic Study or Training Grounds here. So super solid 5, super happy to keep that hand. And that does it for our mulligan section, and that does it for the deck tech here for Dawnwaker Thrasios. This is my favorite cEDH deck. With all the different versions of this deck that have existed throughout the years, I've probably played up to 1,000+ games with this deck in my lifetime. I really, really like this deck. It is the deck that got me my first like competitive accolade, and the fact that I won the Nexus season, the ranked season of their Discord, playing only this deck. This is the only deck I played in every single ranked game. I had more games in that league than any other player for any ranked season, and I had the highest win rate of any player in any season playing this list. And obviously there were different versions of it back in the day. That was back when we were playing like Bloom, Tender, Freed combos, and we were playing Breach before we realized that didn't really synergize a lot with what the deck was doing. So that was a very, very different version of the deck way back in the day. But this is a deck that I've been playing for about over 2 years now, and iterating on for over 2 years now. It is, my paper version is like completely blinged out. It is my favorite cEDH deck, and I'm so glad I get to share this deck tech with you guys today. I really hope you enjoyed it, because it has been a passion project of mine for years now. Speaking of passion projects of mine, if you like content like this, please make sure to like and subscribe to this video. It helps out so much, and you know, I make this stuff for you guys, and I hope you all enjoyed seeing me talk about a deck that I absolutely adore. And if you want to support the channel, or have a deck of yours featured on this channel, like we have a bunch of patron deck techs coming up pretty soon here on the channel. If you would like benefits like that, check out patreon.com/comedianmtg. Any help goes a long way. You can get your name in the show notes, as I mentioned, your own personalized deck tech on the channel. Patrons are people I reach out to play games with a lot, and any support has been super helpful. I'm super grateful for the patrons I already have, and you guys help to improve the quality of this show over and over again. So thank you so much. Thank you for all the people who've been supporting me for a really long time now, and I'm just so grateful. All right, everybody. Hope you have an amazing week, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.